If you were to ask the Dark Tide community how many enemies Smite chains to, the answer you would receive from some would be too many. Psyker's Smite has been a hot discussion topic for a while now, but between the various opinions and discussions circulating around the community, it's difficult to pinpoint just how problematic the ability actually is. Is Smite truly problematic in its current iteration, or is it all just a misunderstanding? Let's talk about it. The idea behind the ability of Smite is, for all intents and purposes, actually very interesting. The ability to lock down and stunlock enemies to either make them easy targets or buy your team time to maneuver is a support player's wet dream, and while not everyone might find watching your team kill everything for you fun, you cannot deny the fact that Smite is an incredibly powerful tool at Psyker's disposal. But the question is, how powerful is it? Smite excels in two main situations: when there are too many enemies on screen at once to safely deal with, and when the horde is physically too dense to deal with before they pose a serious threat. The former refers to massive amounts of a certain enemy type or mixtures of enemies: maulers, crushers, ragers, disablers, gunners, and the like. These enemies are threatening when in isolation, but in massive quantities pose such a serious threat that they can effectively end a run in the blink of an eye. Smite helps keep these enemies under control and opens up windows of opportunity for your team to push up and eliminate these threats both quickly and safely. The latter refers to when hordes themselves are physically too large to deal with. Adding in multiple elites and specials to an already large horde can make that horde infinitely more dangerous to deal with, which Smite can help to safely control. Some maps or map modifiers causes infinite hordes to spawn at key places which threaten your team in an attrition-style fight, and Smite helps here by granting your team the necessary time to regroup, restock, and breathe. Now, while these are all great situations to use Smite in, it's also important to ask how often these above situations actually occur. For one, infinite hordes are map and modifier dependent and may not be relevant depending on the mission you choose to play. By contrast, running into dangerous mixed hordes or running into a deadly amount of crushers and ragers is incredibly common. Or is it? See, while dangerous mixed hordes is the most common threat to see from the aforementioned threats, the specific amount of them are also dependent on the mission you choose. Not specifically which map you choose to play, but which difficulty you choose to play. As you rise in difficulty, not only does the number of enemies increase, but also the frequency at which they spawn. This continues to increase until you reach the maximum difficulty of high-intensity Shock Troop Gauntlet Damnation Orc missions, in which the entire mission is a non-stop, never-ending wall of elites, specials, and hordes. This means that as the difficulty rises, Smite becomes better, as these overwhelming situations will be thrown at you more and more often, whereas as the difficulty lowers, Smite becomes less and less useful, as these same situations become rarer. We can also see a similar situation occur with Assail, but in the reverse. It's better at lower difficulties due to the reduced amount of armored units that spawn, which allows it to do its job unimpeded, and it gets worse the higher in difficulty as more and more armored units spawn. To be clear, I'm not saying that Smite is useless in lower difficulties or Assail is worthless in higher difficulties, but that a different soft meta forms in different difficulties between these two abilities. Is this a bad thing? No, absolutely not. In fact, it's actually good, as the difference in power encourages people to try out different talents and builds, which encourages build variety and makes the game overall more interesting. Despite the fact that one blitz may be slightly stronger than the other in a certain difficulty is not unhealthy for the game, specifically because these two blitzes don't outclass or outshadow each other. They do entirely different things and fit into their own niche, making room for one another and leaving you the option to freely take either one with no downsides. Now, you could probably make a convincing argument that Smite chains to a few too many targets a little too fast and should get a slap on the wrist. While I wouldn't necessarily disagree, I would instead suggest to look away from Smite and towards Brainburst, which has been left in the dust as of late. Rather than nerfing something that is admittedly very strong but not detrimentally so, I would instead suggest for buffing something that is a bit too weak to bring it closer to the other two options, which would make it a more viable choice in play and therefore diversify builds even more. When it comes to high-intensity orc missions, Smite will always be meta due to the sheer amount of enemies. There is no changing that. Lower difficulties could stand to benefit from having Brainburst be an even more viable option though, which would help reduce the amount of times you see Smite and Assail and help shake up build variety just a little bit more. Thanks for watching, and thanks to this month's Patreons for their continued support. Make sure to like and subscribe to see more Darktide videos like this in the future. See y'all next time.